5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
We gotta work on the problems. We gotta link up to solve them. We gotta keep on evolving. Gotta be side by side. Give it up. Gotta be side by side. Everyone. Gotta be side by side. Yeah. We gotta be side by side.
Hello, everybody. Thanks for tuning in to Talks with Tatum. We've started a new project, Side by Side, a podcast, long form type of conversation, and I get the privilege to sit down with some of my friends, the people I've known for a long time, and pick their brain about all of the awesome stuff that's happening in the world. And today we got a very, very special guest, and before I introduce this guy, I'll tell you a little story about the first time that I ever met him.
Oh no.
And the church was doing some interviews for a new youth pastor, and I remember it was a couple of us young kids that were actively involved, whatever that means.
I was going to say, you were like a high school senior, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
What it means to get knighted as a youth group member, to be like, okay, you guys are going to offer the youth perspective on these candidates.
Yeah.
And we visited with a couple candidates, and they were horrible. They were really bad. I remember one guy being like a uber hippie with like half of his shirt unbuttoned.
Do you bring his acoustic guitar with him?
Oh my gosh, he had long hair and the soul patch and everything, and it was a no-go. And then lastly, this guy walks in, this very hip
oh good Lord,
California guy walks in.
The perception changes a lot when you think you know where they're from, don't you? You know, you're like,
and we were like, okay, we can get down with this guy. And then we started to talk. We realized what a creative mind he had. And he was just present, wholly present in all of our conversations. And he had great ideas. And
did you remember any of them? Because I can't remember a single one I said in that
I
meeting.
don't remember. It was all about engagement.
Yeah, it was
all about
I can imagine what I might have said, but
right.
Like, you know, you're like, I wish somebody would record those things, because you probably had a really good idea in the midst of it, and nobody walks out
Does the
remembering.
pitch actually happen?
Yeah,
right?
No idea.
But I remember being blown away by his spirit, and just the person that actually wanted to be there.
No.
You know, so many times in youth ministry we have like, this is just the step that you take, right? And you start hearing.
Not for me. That was not then, anyways. I had no, you know, I had previous experience with youth ministry stuff that I'd been like, no, I'm gonna do this for 20 years, like. And there was some naivete probably in that, but
exactly.
You know, like I believed it. It wasn't blowing smoke. So.
No, and he was wholly present through the whole thing, and I think he blew all three of us away. And obviously, they ended up choosing him, and I ended up having a lot of future work with him. So much stuff. But Reverend Nick Larson, the pastor at First Christian here in Boonville, Missouri.
That's me.
And so much work.
Well, I mean, that's the sort of part of going, like, you start to think about the way that you and I have been in relationship in this last, you know, more than a decade now, in all kinds of different ways and roles and functions, from, you know, pastor, student, to like mentor, mentee, to colleagues, to friends, to everything in between, to same ministry together, ministry apart, ministry together in different ways. Yeah. So I'm grateful for all of it, and I look back on it and it's crazy. I mean, to think of like Gibson running around makes me laugh, because, you know, and then they're like, my oldest isn't all that much younger than you were when we met, kind of thing. You know, she's in middle school now. So you go like, and she didn't exist when you and I met.
Oh my gosh. And so he's a little grayer. But still has more hair than I have.
Hey.
So how about that? But you have a kind of interesting story in terms of how you actually got into ministry in the beginning, and just getting kind of pulled in and saying, hey, this is your ship.
I did no clue, no ministry on my horizon. Grew up kind of in and around a Christian home. Had some, you know, those basic like prayed at the dinner table kind of things growing up, but we weren't active church members. We didn't really go. We went when we saw grandma. We went with grandma to church, right? Kind of thing. That was our experience growing up. But really had a very wonderful gift of deep faith from that. Like in witnessing some of those relationships in my life, I mean, like my grandma's faith was not something she spoke a lot about, but it's something that she lived, and that always made a big impression on me. But the girl I was dating at the time, like, brought me to church with her, literally to paint their youth room when they hired this new associate youth minister. And I ended up painting next to him all day. We were painting the youth room like black and bright yellow and like neon color. I mean, very 90s ministry stuff. Like, and we were just painting next to each other. And I just talked, I talk to anybody. Like, he and I are just chatting it up. At the end of the day, he asked me and Julia if we'd come be adult mentors in the new youth ministry. And I was like, I don't even go to this church. And he's like, I don't care. He's like, I just spent the day talking to you. I think you'd be great. And so I very reluctantly said yes. And he matched me with a group of incoming freshmen in high school there were about 3 or 4 of them that first, like, at the start. And I was a freshman in college. And for 4 years, I journeyed with these young men through their faith questions. And they had a lot more questions than I had answers or questions. I mean, things that I had never examined or looked at. But it was their curiosity and their hunger and their desire to take, like, the teachings of Jesus seriously. I still remember we were like given a small group sheet, and we were in the balcony. That's where our small group met. And we were sitting around on the pews chatting about something or other. And the small group lesson for that week was on turn the other cheek. And we're reading the scripture and we're like starting to talk about it. And it's a passage I'd heard a bunch of times in my life, but I don't know that I'd ever really considered how to apply it. And one of the kids looked at me and he goes, "Do you really expect me to do this in the locker room tomorrow morning?" And I was like, I think I said something like, I think that's what Jesus expects. Like, right? Like, what would that really look like? And I just remember that kind of conversation. And we cut through all the, malarkey that gets involved in the process. And we're really like examining this stuff and looking at it and trying to apply it to our lives. And it was their curiosity and questions and conversations like that really stuck with me. But then as I was getting ready to graduate college and go off and be a graphic designer and build websites for folks, God had other things in mind. I mean, that's the way it kind of works. I remember I was at the church late one night and kind of arguing out loud with God, talking to him about being like, what do you want me to do here? Like, what's going on? And the senior minister had asked me about like coming on staff and working with the youth. And I said, no, I don't. Like, I was like, I'm not not qualified, not part of it. I'm going to go do this other thing. Mm-hmm. And it was the relationship with kids that, like, what happens to this program when the associate left and they're kind of in this bind and they need someone to step in and they really need an internal candidate. And I said, like, no, but he came in, and I didn't know it at the time, but the senior minister used to show up on Friday nights and preach his sermon for Sunday to an empty congregation. He's like rehearse it in the pulpit kind of thing. Wow. And so he came he's banging on the doors, unlocking them. And I'm like, who's breaking into the building or whatever? And I go downstairs and David looked at me and he goes, so have you thought about what I asked you? Are you willing to do it? And my internal conversation said no, but my mouth said yes. And so I, in quick-witted fashion, followed it up with until you find someone else, a qualification. But for me, the work is something I loved. It was like from day one, getting more time to have more of those conversations, more time to plan for things, more time to be in relationships with folks in the church, less to worry about stress of, doing the artistic thing of like building a website for somebody else who's like telling you it should be purple when you're like, it doesn't look good in purple. It's like, oh. And so it really just, the work of ministry was something I fell in love with. And I did it for about 3.5 years and took on some college ministry that was a ministry partner on campus not far from that home church. And just loved it. And that's what was like, okay, when my girlfriend at the time, my fiance, finished her degree, it was like, all right, what are we doing next? Okay, it's my time. Like, if I'm going to do this as a career, I should probably go get a degree, like some training on how to do it. And that was what took us to California, and seminary out there. Went to San Francisco Theological Seminary, which taught me a lot of great things, met a lot of great friends and relationships through that. And then for me, God did the sort of thing where showed me also the thing that I wasn't. Going in, I wasn't really, like, denominations were just like things. They weren't really distinctions in a really important way. But what I encountered was in seminary, as I was looking at it and trying to consider it, is like, I went to a Presbyterian school and I learned I'm not a Presbyterian. Like, I don't need to do things decently and in order. I need to have space and freedom to wrestle and struggle and figure it out. And like, the group of people that you're with is the like most important group of Christians. Like, that doesn't mean you don't have covenant relationship with larger groups and bodies and denominations. But for me, it was like, no, like, the local church is where that, you know best what you all need, and you work together to figure it out. And so, like, it was that and the sort of weekly communion practices and the things that was like, oh no, I'm a disciple. Like, I really, really am. And it made sense to me. And that's kind of where, launched coming out of that.
What was that? Was that first church Presbyterian?
No, it was a federated congregation, which isn't really common these days. But back in the 60s, it was one of these things that's in the ecumenical movement. Sometimes multiple denominations would like federate together. And so that one specifically was American Baptist Disciples. And it was the work of Mark Yaconelli, who some folks might know. His dad, Mike Yaconelli, who was like youth specialties, which was a huge youth ministry thing, and still like is a good youth ministry thing, did a lot of really good relational ministry work. And he did a thing called the Youth Ministry and Spirituality Project, which was like not looking at youth ministry from the lens of going like, how do we have fun with kids and then, slip in a little Jesus, where it's like, we're going to come together and play games, but like, how do we teach spiritual disciplines to teenagers? How do we really form them in the rhythm and practice of church? And that's what I was like wanting to do, because that's where I was. Like, as a young college student, I discovered things like Celebration of Discipline and Richard Foster's work and that kind of thing of going like, and it was so fascinating to me that I would just take it to youth group and we'd just teach it. And now I look back on it and I'm like, that's a little crazy, but it worked because the key to youth ministry, and really all ministry, is like the passion of the person doing it is infectious.
If you're invested.
And if I'm invested, they're invested, and I was invested. And so they saw it and they took, well, if, I know him, and if he's interested, then I'm interested. And it worked really well. And so that he was doing his PhD work at the Graduate Theological Union, which is 9 seminaries in the Bay Area, of which SFTS is one of them. And his office was in one of the SFTS buildings. And they had, said, yeah, we have an office space that you can do your PhD research and this stuff out of. And so I'd been in conversation with Mark a little bit. And so when I started looking at seminaries, I was like, any seminary that's supporting this work is a seminary worth checking out. And then SFTS is literally kind of like going to Hogwarts. It's these beautiful old buildings that were built, early 1910s kind of thing, these stone castles literally on a hill in just north of the Golden Gate Bridge. And so it was sort of like, you go out and you just fall in love with the location and the place, and the folks that I met were really good. And I was like, and I could do there's an American Baptist seminary affiliated with the GTU and a Disciples affiliated seminary in the GTU. And so like, you get whatever denomination I wanted to be a part of, I could access through SFTS. And they didn't, you don't need to be a Presbyterian. And the irony is, a lot of us Disciples folks who did go to SFTS used to joke that there was always at least one disciple in every class. So there's, there were, my grade, I think there were 40 kids on campus, like 40 adults. on campus, like in our grade, who started together kind of thing. And so out of every 40, there's like one disciple. So there were always 3 or 4 of us on campus, and we did a lot of things over at Pacific School of Religion, and the Disciple Seminary Foundation has a good presence there, and they do some really good work. And so it was like I had access to disciple stuff if I wanted to go that way, which I ended up doing and was really beneficial. But it left me a lot of opportunity to explore what I was passionate about, and so
perspective
it was good. But one of the things I'm really now looking back on it super grateful for was the idea that it helped me rubbing up against people who did things differently, helped me see how I wanted to do it or what I felt like was where God was calling me to do it. And there were lots of great things. I mean, I worked for a Presbyterian church there in San Francisco, a new church plant that was doing sort of emergent church style stuff, which is, now kind of an old term. But Mission Bay was a great community and was a super fantastic. It was like what I really needed. And I did some really good ministry there for a number of years while I was in school. And so it was like now I look back on it, I was like, it was so formative and so important to have that exploration work there in San Francisco.
How's that contrast to a more traditional type of ministry now, or more traditional church setting?
In terms of the new church plant stuff?
Yeah.
I mean, I think a lot of it was, so when I started attending and working, the congregation was about 7 years old. It had started in homes for several years, and then they rented a first space, and they were on like space number 4 or 5 at that point. Oh. And they rented an old .com building that the band manager for Third Eye Blind owned, and he renovated it in order to be an open concept. He was going to live in it. So he put like a kitchen in one corner of this big old sort of renovated office space. And he got engaged, and his fiance apparently nixed the idea. She's like, I'm not living in that building. And so they did something else. But they had offices upstairs, but this whole big, like what was going to be this sort of like open concept thing was the living space. And so the church had rented that out. And what was really different is like we didn't know, like it felt like every month we didn't know if we were going to have enough money for rent, and rent in San Francisco is insane. So that's the part of like the day-to-day of it. And so there was all kinds of stuff. We rented the space out to other things. We got a partner with a catering company that used to teach cooking classes out of it, because there was like a kitchen in one corner.
Right.
And then they'd set up like prep stations around, and it was fascinating. I mean, just things that you're like, by hook or by crook kind of thing, you needed to get work done. And so there wasn't, you'd do things and you I helped launch some of the like small group stuff that was like, we hadn't really done small groups before. And so we were asking the genuine question, like, what would a small group look like for this group? And the neat thing about it is it was a young community. The oldest member of our congregation was in his 50s. And so it was, and some of that is because when you settle down in San Francisco, you often can't afford to live in the city, so you move out of the city. And so a lot
Suburbs.
of the folks who are living in San Francisco proper are often, young professionals who are renting themselves and doing that kind of thing. And so we had a really neat, it was different than traditional ministry for the like renting reason. And then also that young population, like it's sort of like every other minister in the country is jealous of this idea that you have all like these 20 and 30 year olds. And so it really helped me. And I mean, I'm on the upper end of that group. I'm working with a lot of my peers and such. And it was fantastic. It was really eye-opening and cool. And then they were working to sort of like, they were in that phase of new church planting where they were trying to transition from being just a startup to then like, what are we going to look like in 5 years, in 10 years?
Right.
And so then even during my time, we ended up partnering with an older Presbyterian church in another neighborhood of San Francisco where we shared space. And so we moved into this old traditional building from like we used to call it the silver box, because he had painted all the walls and the floor and the silver were this like silver gray. And it was a very like, hip modern space. And then we went from that to like stained glass windows, and which was both like awesome because like it changed the feel in a like it's like instant sacredness, right? Like you walk into this Julia Morgan style sanctuary. It's literally like a famous architect who built that sanctuary, and it's beautiful. And yet that congregation welcomed us into like, we removed some rows of pews so that we could make some more family friendly areas and different things that really worked. And it was a good partnership, and we were able to help them with some of the finances of it. And so I went through that kind of that recreation of a new congregation, and that I think was the biggest thing, is that like in a more traditional congregation, it feels like you don't go through life cycles so quickly.
Right.
Your life cycle might be 10 years,
extended,
20 years from like, oh, this is the thing where, I worked for them for about 3.5 years where I was on staff with them. And we probably went through 2 or 3 evolutions in those 3 years of like rethinking who we are and looking at it new, because that's the nature of it. Was also young life. We were always there were always new folks coming and joining, and we were always sort of bidding folks farewell who might have been like, they had worked their first job in San Francisco for 4 or 5 years, and now some company in Chicago or New York or wherever offered them, it's like, you're going to get this promotion, but you have to leave San Francisco. And so they'd move away or, and so it was like constantly
turnover.
So it's shifting versus in a traditional setting where you're like, here in Boonville, where it's sort of like, I have generations of families where it's like, I have 3 generations, 4 generations of a single family unit that all live here in Boonville and have and love it. And that part of like, your ministry is through the generations,
right,
where you're like, this is familiar, and there's like even those folks that they may have moved away, but then they move back because this community is one of those kind of communities for them that even as they move away, it's much more like it has that family sense in the long passage of time, which was so different than the new church planting, which was sort of like the shorter time frames.
Is there something to be said of that more frequent pivot and our more like kind of modern ministry?
I think you have that sense of, you can have that sense of identity. That sense of identity is a lot stronger in the community in some ways because they know what their identity is, right, versus a lot of times a traditional church may have a really strong identity, but they don't always know how to articulate it. They certainly don't always know how to share it with their wider community. And because you're doing that work of rethinking and like you're kind of like redoing that work of ministry over and over again, who you are, and like in a way that you can share and it's digestible. And so that's a huge advantage on one hand, but the negative is like, it's a little like running on a treadmill where, like you're like, didn't we just do a visioning process like a year ago? And you're like, cause if your folks are changing and you like the vision we had when we were renting the .com building needed to look different than when we moved into a Julia Morgan sanctuary, right? Like the same vision doesn't work in the same place because you have to take advantage of like, what are our advantages where in the silver box, you look like a less traditional church, so you can lean into that a little more versus when you're in a stained glass area, you're like, it's not like we became instantly a traditional congregation, right, but we had some new assets now where you had that sort of like ancient future thing going on where you could be like, you don't have to create that feeling of sacredness in the same way you did in the .com, but you do have to kind of now, what are the signals we can give to folks to show them that we're up on what's going on in the life of a young adult, where you're like the young adult who might be skeptical walking into a more traditional looking building where like, hey, my friend invites me to come to worship on Sunday morning or even Sunday night, like at this .com building. You're kind of like, well, I might as well figure out what, I don't have a lot of expectations other than I will know what it is when I get there, kind of thing. You're like, you can sort of witness it.
Yeah.
When you walk into a more traditional building, there's a little more
I've
of like,
been there, done
what
that.
will I find?
Yeah.
There's either that expectation that I know exactly what this will be like, or the neat thing is you can craft it in such a way when they walk in, they're like, but I've not seen this before.
Right.
And but it's like the same vision doesn't work in both places. So you have to kind of redo some of that work on a regular basis in a way that you can allow a vision to unfold more slowly in a traditional congregational context where there's history there. There's like this congregation's been here since, 1887 or whatever it is. I hope I get that number right. But, it's that sort of part of going like this sanctuary, there was a fire in the 1930s here and the old folding wooden building like burnt down, and they rebuilt the sanctuary that's here was built in, that 1930s. And then the education building was built 30 years later in the 1960s. It's like you have these like 30-year periods, 40-year periods that are defining of them as a congregation, where you're like in the new church plant, you have like this year. And we had the same kind of markers, right? Like moving from this building to that building, or having this person or bringing this person on staff, or would change the dynamic a lot in the same kind of ways, but the time scale is so different.
Well, I mean, there's more traditional environment very much sparks in me this idea of this is what we do versus this is who we are. And so it's very ingrained in this idea of these are our traditions, these are our practices.
Well, and the beauty of them is that hopefully they're ones that really serve you really well. Like, sometimes they are, and sometimes they're not. I think that was one of the gifts of that COVID did, is it sort of forced the church to stop doing some things that it had always done.
Right.
And then as some ministry can, like, as we begin this new like hybrid style stuff where it's like you don't get rid of what we had been doing during COVID, but you can do some things you used to do. Like we got a real opportunity to sort of ask, like, do we really miss that thing that we were doing?
Well, and the question, I mean, the real question is, now that we've kind of had that moment to reassess and recalibrate, is there more benefit to taking those moments and those breaths, even with a larger vision and a long-term vision, to say, is this still the destination that we want to go to, or do we need to shift the vision in a certain direction?
Yeah.
And have we traveled the road that we intended to, or did something else happen in that route? And lots of churches aren't doing that particular work. It's just like, well, this is our 5 or 10 or 20 year plan, and we're just going to keep chugging along despite the changes that are happening around us.
And that's, I'm grateful for that experience with Mission Bay, where there's sort of that part of going like, I learned to change quickly. Like I learned to shift and to do that.
So obviously you have a transition from Mission Bay to this, from the church plant idea to a more almost individual type of ministry with the chaplaincy. How did that come about?
So one of the requirements for disciples ordination in the region I was ordained, which was in Indiana, is to do a unit of CPE, clinical pastoral education. And so you can do that in different contexts, but the most common context is in the hospital setting. And so I did, within CPE, it's typically unpaid if you do one unit, which is like a summer. Cool. But if you do the year-long program and you do 4 units, it usually comes with a stipend. And so there was a program at St. Mary's Medical Center in San Francisco, and I just needed the 1 unit, but they had a student leave early. And so I got the opportunity to go do 1 unit, picking up her salary because she had gotten a full-time job and had to leave early, kind of thing. And so I got to jump in and get the 1 unit, and it was paid. And so I did it. And it was really a transformative experience, like to do that one-on-one ministry, to like leave congregational context. That's the first time I had done ministry like that. And my supervisor at the time, Ruth, came to me about halfway through that unit, and she said, I am interviewing candidates for next year's program. What do you think about staying for a year? And she's like, I think it would be really like CPE, while it is important, the chaplaincy work that you do with patients in the hospital, it is very much designed to be a formative process for creating clinically trained chaplains.
Okay.
And so it's like transformative for the chaplain. And she's like, I think it would really benefit you. And it was like another year of staying in San Francisco with a stipend. And so we were like, yeah, and it gave me time to search for congregational ministries and be a little more picky along the road of kind of going like, all right, I can do this. And if the perfect call comes along in unit 1, that's not the goal to leave them in the lurch, but you can do it.
Yeah.
And that sort of thing. And so I said yes and ended up staying through. And so I did almost in total, it's like, 15, 16 months at this hospital and did clinical like ministry. So I had an oncology unit and then a skilled nursing unit that were kind of my assigned floors. And then you do all kinds of other things with on-call stuff and everywhere else where you're in the emergency room or doing trauma work or in the ICU. But those were kind of my units. And so you had to get used to the idea of like, I had always come from and wanted to do ministry over a period of time. Like even in the new church plant kind of environment, like I didn't want to stay for a year. They kept me on staff for 3.5 years. And I had done about that same stint with my first congregation. And it's sort of like, in some ways, I'm the type of pastor who feels like I've been there 3 years. I'm just starting to get to know folks. Like now is when I really know what I'm doing. Versus maybe like I couldn't be a Methodist who, they're every year they're reevaluating and potentially moving congregations. It's like, nope, can't do that. Like, God bless you if you can, but I can't do that. And I had to get used to the idea that I like went and knocked on a door and that single interaction may be the only interaction I ever get with that person. And so
powerful.
it you have to work with what you got in the moment. There isn't this sort of like, well, I'll put a pin in that and come back to it in a future meeting, or like you don't have this sort of part of like waiting for a moment in which something's happening in their life that allows you to speak to a particular idea or a theology. Or doing it with chaplaincy, you walk in and you use whatever's there. One of the greatest quotes about clinical pastoral education that sticks with me was the idea of 90% of the work is showing up. Or there was one of the mentors who used to say, don't just do something, stand there. And the idea is what you're really doing as a chaplain is you are the only one in the hospital environment who has no other task. Your only job is to be the spiritual and emotional support for that patient while you're with them. And so it can look like anything. It can look like holding their hand because they just need to not be alone. It could be working through, why is this happening to me? Where is God in the midst of it? It can be, I have no faith at all, but I need to try and make sense to what's happening to me. Or it could be the family member who's overwhelmed, who's like trying to listen to a doctor who can't, because of their emotional and otherwise, like they're under such pressure and stress in that moment that like they can't process any information. And so your job is to like be their ears. And then the doctor walks away because they have other patients or other things. And they ask you that question of like, well, what did he just say?
Right.
And you have to kind of like, what did you hear? What can I tell you? What can I repeat that the doctor just said? Because I'm not under that tremendous stress. Like, I am here for you, and my job is to like, so sometimes you're just kind of like the translator in the room. And it was really powerful for me to like learn to take all my stuff and leave it at the door. Like, I had a stressful day. It doesn't matter and like when you're in congregational ministry, like sometimes those things are like very real. Like if I'm having a stressful day at home with the kids, you walk into church and you're talking to somebody else and they may be having a stressful day with their kids, and it becomes this like relatability point or this thing to build or this way to get to know each other over the long term. Like as a chaplain, they don't really need to know me.
Right.
Like that I am not important in this moment. Like, and our relationship in that way is not really important. It's like, what do you need and how can I meet that need?
Right. Your presence is what you're bringing to the table.
It's like, I had to learn, like, you can't correct somebody's theology in the moment. Like they're in an emergency situation. Like this is sometimes life or death. Like I don't need to be like, well, I'm not so sure that's the most biblically accurate way to translate that. Like, no, like that is selfish in that moment.
Yeah.
And you just work with what you got. And what I loved about it was that opportunity, but it was also what it taught me was like how much I missed relationship building. One of the things when you're working as a clinically trained chaplain is that the ethics of chaplaincy require that you allow people to leave the hospital and you do not get to follow up with them. It's much more like a therapist-patient relationship where it's like, no, you need to keep some professional boundaries in a way that's different than like clergy and congregational ministers have professional boundaries too. But one of them is not like, hey, I don't get to know what happened with Paul and his mom who went home.
Right.
Like she has cancer. She got this really powerful diagnosis. She is no longer acutely ill and then now goes home. And I don't know what happened. Did she live? Did she die? What,
we get birth to death, right?
Yeah. Like in the congregational ministry, you get all of it.
Yeah.
Like in the clinical setting, you don't. And it taught me I missed it. It was like there was a day I still remember going onto the unit and I was standing outside the door and you get so used to knocking on a door and walking in on a total stranger, like that doesn't get it. At first it's really anxiety producing, but after a while you just kind of like, you get really used to being told, no, I don't want to talk to the chaplain. And that's like, at first you're like, why not? I'm awesome too. And then after a while you're like, no, actually that's fine with me. Like check, like your need is for me to not be here. I met that need by not being here. And I got a list of patients. Like you never got through everybody. There was always another room to knock on. So you go, but there was a day I remember going to knock on this door and I went to knock on it and I thought, I want them to say no because I don't know that my heart can take getting to know another story right now. And I learned, I was like, oh, that's about me. And it's a really important thing to know of like, this is the kind of ministry that feeds me, is to be able to do that follow-up work and to be able to do that long-term pastoral care that's different than spiritual chaplaincy. Like it's different than working with what you got. It's sort of like there's more, there's amazing transformation possible for individuals in that critical moment of their life, but it's just a moment. It's not like getting to revisit a long-term issue with a person over 5 years or whatever it would be, like a long timetable. And so you're like, it's not one visit, it's 5 years worth of coffees. And it's just a different ministry. And so that was a huge shift for me from clinical, pastoral education kind of chaplaincy work to congregational work. And it really did show me I have a love for congregational ministry. And I ended up at Broadway because they found me. I still don't know exactly how my paperwork ended up on their desk, but I still remember Roger, who was one of the co-chairs on the committee, called me and he's like, we totally want you to come interview. And I was kind of like, you don't turn down an interview. Someone's calling you like, hey, we're interested in you for a job. You might as well hear them out. Yeah. And every conversation, I got more and more excited about the work and the ministry that was being done, the uniqueness of the congregation. And the part of it was like, and the neat thing for me is I had a background in youth ministry. I knew how to do it. But the position they called me to was congregational ministry. Youth ministry was a part of it, and it wasn't solo youth ministry. It was sort of like with volunteers and leaders and other part-time staff people and other things. And it was really an eye-opening and wonderful experience to kind of move into that and kind of look at youth ministry from the sort of part of like, I know how to change with the kids as they change, just like the new church planting was, where it's like it's shifting because we got some new folks in, and so we have some new energy here, and we need to capture that energy and use it. But it also had that long term of like, I'm not going anywhere. Like there are kids who are going to be born here at 0, who I get to do baby dedications with, who when they turn, 11 and get into 6th grade, they're going to come into youth group in a different way. And I was like, yes. Like, and where I was at coming out of chaplaincy to congregational ministry like that really spoke to me about being able to do it for the long haul. And my worry with youth ministry was always the sort of part of like youth ministry, like I think the national average, certainly at that time, and it's probably still true now, is like 2.5 years, and
probably less now,
like 16 months in a position. And it's like, I didn't want that. That was the thing chaplaincy taught me at that moment, was like, this is not the environment you thrive in. Like, not that I couldn't do it. And now I look back on it and I was like, there were some really nice things. Sometimes congregational ministry leads to the place where it's like, what your issue is, and you work on it over and over and over again, and sometimes it feels like you're not going to make any progress.
Yeah.
And you're like, sometimes it's nice to just knock on the door and not know what you're going to get.
The newness.
You're like, every interaction is a new interaction. Every conversation is a new moment. And you're like, there's some advantages to that I don't know that I was seeing at that moment in my life, but it was really formative, and it did. And that's where, I served Broadway Christian for, basically 10 years, 9.5 years or whatever, when I left about 2 years ago now. So
how about the freedom that you kind of got to form some of these ministries and birth?
Oh yeah. I mean, that was the beauty of that congregation, is that they want to say yes. So many ministries and churches are skeptical of new, and Broadway was not. They were supportive and encouraging and enthusiastic about that sort of part. And there's something in that congregation that I think some of the original, charter members knew they needed to hand the keys to new generations sooner and sooner. And there was a real effort to do that. And so when you're doing youth and children's ministry in that, you have that opportunity to do a lot of that stuff, and you're working with families, and you're like saying, no, like your family can help shape this for all families. It's not like we don't just minister to you, we minister with you. And that accompaniment piece was really powerful for me. And it just means people jump on board and they do stuff, and you have freedom, because like, that's the beauty of youth ministry, is like, you get real tight with a group of kids, and they're kind of like, they form an identity, but like 2 years later, you got a new group of 6th graders. Like, that first group might really be into like sports and like thinking about that sort of thing. And so you're at soccer games and you're doing ministry with them, and you're like in their life in that way. You might get another group that they have no interest in that. They're like all about theater, and you're like, so you're like, you go from like having a, youth group where you're playing kickball and you're doing these sort of like the fun downtime stuff is all like athletic, to like, we're playing dodgeball all the time, to like a group that's like, no, we'd rather write our own puppet shows and do these like different really transformative things. And like, we want to, and so the fun part with youth ministry is you're like, you just, you're struggling with how to engage a certain group. In some ways, you just keep struggling with that group, and there's going to be another group not far behind them that will have different interests. And the way I believe you do youth ministry is like it's like the thing you do through youth ministry can change. It's like the heart and the love and the passion and the uplifting kind of, you are a beloved child of God thing. Like, that's the work of youth ministry, is reminding teenagers that as they grow and change, that they're beloved children of God, no matter what. And like, if you're going to go try on this new personality, like, try it on, find out if that's who God created you to be. Like, I'm not worried. I still remember I had this conversation with a parent at Broadway who was so worried that their middle schooler had like kind of gone silent on them and was, you know, kind of brooding in their room and all this sort of stuff. And I'd done youth ministry long enough where you can say to them, you just have faith. You have to have a little faith that what you've done to form them as a human being up to this moment, like you gotta have to like let them own it for themselves now. And so they got to wrestle with it. And it sometimes looks really scary, but 95% of teenagers come out on the other end grateful and want to re-engage with their family in a real way. And you're like, so you say to them like, hang in there, you know, like they'll come back to you. Like, you know, the kid who, particularly the mom or dad who, you know, it's like dad with a daddy's girl who then gets into middle school and high school and just doesn't want dad around. And like, I get it. Like, and we all get it on an intellectual level, but when it's your kid,
it's so close.
It's real hard to like give them the space they need, even if you know they need the space. Yeah. And so it was, but it had that mentality of like, you just wait, like time, trust the process. One of my colleagues at Broadway, Pastor Terry, used to say, you have to trust the shuffle. Like you're leaning into what the Spirit's doing in this moment. You trust that the way this is all going to work out is God's going to do something with it, even if you don't quite know what it's going to be yet. And I've loved that piece. I find myself repeating it all the time. Got to just trust the shuffle here.
Yeah. What they say, I guess AA is keep showing up, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's half the battle.
Well, and that's that sort of piece of like the gift for me from chaplaincy was that part of like, you know, don't just do something, stand there. It's like, it's not what you're doing that's the most important thing. It's that you're there, that you're present, that you're engaged with them, that they know you're there for them, whether that's a text message, showing up at a thing, or, you know, calling them on a random Tuesday.
And how different is that interaction? You know, I was at the hospital this morning visiting with a member and a family in the ICU, and how different is that interaction from chaplaincy to just kind of getting to be that random stranger and have that interaction? That's a special interaction.
Yeah,
being
yeah.
present
Well,
to going for your congregational member that you've had all this.
As the pastor walking into the room, you're bringing all that history and that outside world into that room. When you're a chaplain, you're sort of a blank slate for them, and so they don't know you. And in some ways, they don't have to see you later.
Yeah.
So sometimes they would tell you things that they might not tell their pastor because, like, I got to deal with my pastor when I get out of here. Like, and not necessarily in a good or a bad way, but just in a like. Sometimes it's a lot easier to tell the stranger a truth than it is to tell, like, you know, it's like your buddy you meet on the airplane, you can have a really pretty frank conversation with because you're like, I will never see this person ever again. And so whatever I need to unburden myself with in this moment, I can, and I can have that sort of trust that they don't have anybody to tell.
Right. And that blank canvas can be good sometimes.
Yeah. And
you've seen it done poorly.
Yeah.
I mean,
you can do it.
I mean, I've even encountered chaplains, you know, coming to a space and, you know, I'm sitting right there, you know.
Yep.
But, you know, they're going to come and they're going to not read the room and not be present. And just start to preach. And it's.
Yeah. No. And that was the part of like, and that's the process of CP, and the like board certified chaplains know how to be a blank slate to work with what you have, not bring what your stuff into the room with you. And I'm real grateful for that. But like then as a pastor, you don't get that opportunity. You walk in with the stuff, but you also then walk out like having the power of like, they just, I often say the most important thing in that pastoral care interaction is like, it's not even always what you talked about. It's that you were there.
Yeah.
I was just talking to a member of church on Sunday who, you know, she had hip surgery and ended up in a hospital and then had to do a long stint in rehab, and her rehab was over in Columbia. And so it's far enough that like friends and family, they come to visit, but nobody's stopping by every single day because it's, you know, 40 minutes round trip in the car. If you're lucky, it's an hour in the car if you're not. And so I'd go by and see her, and she was like saying that I showed up on a Sunday night and I brought her communion because she could watch the church service online, but So she had been present with us in worship, and she heard people praying for her, and she knew that she was cared for. But like, I don't know what we talked about in our interaction, but she remembered I brought communion and I showed up, and that is always that reminder. And that's the power that chaplaincy taught me, is like, you're showing up. Yes, it's different showing up as the pastor than as the chaplain, but it's the presence that still makes the biggest impact. And it's like, what you do, you got to sort of trust with the Holy Spirit. It's sort of like what I often talk about in preaching. My preaching professor used to say, your job is to figure out what you want to say and not try and worry about what people are going to hear, because the Spirit does the work between your mouth and their ears, and people will often hear what they need to hear. And that's been confirmed. I still remember there are folks who came through a handshake line after church, and they're telling me, like, it was so important that you said blah, 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 blah. And then you're like, okay. And then they walk away, and you're like, did I really say that? Like, I don't remember saying that.
That wasn't the takeaway I was planning.
But not necessarily in a bad way. Like, sometimes you're like, damn, I wish I had said that. Like, that was really good. Like, I'm so glad you synthesized what the Spirit was doing, what the text was saying, what I was trying to add into this nugget that you can hold on to all week.
Yeah.
Like, you walked out of that knowing what God wanted you to do, and you're like, hallelujah, that's preaching. Like,
well, I've been pushing to my church this year, this idea, not my idea, which I didn't know. This idea, present, not perfect. I didn't know it was a whole book and this whole thing.
Well, and it's not an original concept, and I don't know that particular book, but it really,
But this idea, that the most important things that were present, you got to show up and put the pursuit of perfection somewhere else. But in the ministry piece, I mean, that whole idea is like, show up, bring the best of you that you have to the table, and let the Spirit do the rest.
Right.
And it never fails. And speaking of that, we got to work together in youth ministry on this idea of doing these youth worships that were very much birthed from something authentic and turned into something that was a much bigger production. Where did you get the audacity to like hand me reins and say, hey, let's...
Well, I think some of that was me. I mean, like, you can look back at, that original youth pastor's name was Tim, right? And he said to me, like, I want you to be a leader, not like I want you to be a leader when I wasn't a member of that church. That personhood is more important than something else. There's sort of that part of like, it's not about finding your belonging through, like, I came down front and joined a congregation. It's like, your spirit matches the spirit that we need. And that was the part of, for me, like, I mean, by the time I gave you the reins, I knew who you were, right? It's not like, and I didn't know what it would look like, but I did know that the Spirit that God was doing something with you, and my job was to sort of like fan the flame, right? Like your job is just to kind of get out of the way and kind of go like, yep. And I remember, like, I in youth ministry in that first church, the senior pastor did a really brilliant thing with me that I am incredibly grateful for. He got out of the way with things that were really valuable. There were lots of kids in that youth ministry program that were not part of the church at large, that they came because they had a friend who, had a friend. And that was a congregation at the time that worshiped about 120 in person, like people in the congregation. Membership was, slightly larger than that or whatever. And we were having 40 to 55 kind of youth on a Wednesday night, 10 to 20 of whom were like, their families were a part of the church, the other 30 to 40 who weren't. And so you had a lot of like kids coming to faith through that, of like, oh, this is like a real thing. And their church experience is through that youth group. It's through youth worships. It's through other things that we're doing. And we'd always try and integrate them into Sunday morning, but there's a different feel to it. And so they struggled sometimes, or they didn't other times. But the senior minister was like, come do this Sunday morning stuff with me. So I was preaching, I was doing pastoral care work, I was doing pastoral prayers. And we got to things like, he was like, you're doing communion this week. And I'm like, I don't know how to do communion. And he's like, I'll show you. Like, it's not like, I'll show you the logistics. Like, here are the words, like, here's where it comes from. Here's the scripture thing. I'd walk in and have a question about like some deep theological issue, and he wouldn't give me the answer. He'd hand me a book and he'd be like, go read this, go do this. And he trusted me. I'm not going to tell you what to say to the student who I don't know. I'm going to like give you more depth that you can bring to that conversation. And so it was done for me. And so the audacity came from having it modeled for me, where it was sort of like, the most important thing here is that this is a thing I've seen. I feel the Spirit doing this kind of movement, and I'm going to like empower and uplift and entrust that. And then I'm going to not disappear, which is the other sort of part. The older I get, the more I realize the real trick is not the permission giving. It's the accountability piece with that. How do I make sure that this person who has the passion, the charisma, the ability to do this ministry work, how do I make sure that they don't flame out, that their passion for it doesn't just burn super hot for a short amount of time, and then when they hit some kind of a barrier, they give up. Right. Which is the sort of part of like with our youth worship things, a lot of it was like we'd have ones that went really, really well, and then we'd have some that didn't go so well. Like it didn't really work, right? And my role at the time was like, we're doing it again next month. Like we're doing another one. Like we don't have to do the same one, but we're doing another one. And not allowing you to kind of hit a dud and then want to give up. Like, and not that, I don't know that you ever necessarily said that specifically to me, but there was sort of a part where your energy would go, after you have a dud, your energy is naturally lower. And so you're like, and my job was to like ride out the highs and lows. I was the consistent one to say, nope, like we still got to do youth worship next week or next month or whatever it would be. And you're like, and sometimes, I mean, there were days where it was like neither you nor I had an idea how to make this month work. But the relentlessness of those days force you to try. And I think sometimes the best ones come out of this idea that like, it wasn't a fully formed idea when we sat down because we didn't overthink it. But there was a spark of inspiration there, and we are in a place, like, I mean, that's the beauty of teenagers. Like, if a thing sucks and you admit that it sucks, they'll move on from it. They don't get hung up on it. No one's like, oh, darn, like, why are we giving up so soon or something? They just move on. And so, and the beauty of the youth worship thing from a youth minister, like, adult perspective was I'd talk to a kid and some kids would be like, I didn't like this month. And I'm like, don't worry, next month will be totally different. Like, if you don't like this one, hang out because it'll change.
Exactly.
Like, there'll be another one that you might really like. And that's so true. Like, there were some kids who really liked the quiet weeks that were kind of like solemn and melodic and were kind of dark and mysterious. And others were liked the dancing kind of like really up high energy praise stuff. And you're like, well, don't worry, they all kind of come back. And
I am so thankful for those experiences because there's a number of things. But the first one was this idea of I learned not to be invested in the thing. Like I was never invested in like this song or this style. It was all invested in like, how do I create a space for people to encounter the Spirit? Yeah. And when it succeeds, great. And when it doesn't succeed, back to the drawing board. But that freedom of you being a stabilizing force and saying, we're going to come back.
Yeah, we're going to do this again.
Right. It was like this idea of, it gave me courage to not stop reaching, because your natural inclination is if you reach for something that's maybe out of your wheelhouse or maybe out of your comfort zone, to pull back a little bit.
And there's this part of like, I mean, from a musical perspective too, you were not the musician you are now when you started.
Not even remotely.
And some of that was like, but you trusted me enough to say like, no, you don't Like, I still remember the week you walked in and you're like, I'm going to play guitar this month. And I was like, he can play the guitar? Like, he'd only ever played the piano up until this point. And I was like, okay. I mean, like, because there's this sort of part of, like, you and I both knew if it didn't work, like, you weren't going to do, you know, it was like, and so you just, there's a nice part about, like, I know there's going to be another week. It's one of those things. I had my preaching professor used to say, that, like, don't try and preach every sermon in a week. You've got 40 years to preach sermons.
Yeah.
Like, she used to say to me all the time, because I try and shove everything smart I could think of into one sermon. And you're like, nobody can process that.
Yeah.
Like, that doesn't make sense. Like, there's no breathing space. There's no rhythm to it. There's no, you know, like, it was just, they were miserable sermons of, like, I'm so smart I can change the world, seminary student. And you're like, what she taught me was to, like, you just strip those out. Like, you write down the ideas and you're like, every idea you have, if it doesn't fit in this sermon, it'll fit in another sermon.
Exactly.
Like, you got another week. You got another thing. There is a relentlessness to Sundays. And there's that, which was the sort of like that part. And, like, I hear Jana's voice in my head saying, there's a relentlessness to Sundays. You don't need to preach them all in one week. And that gift was true for that too, like, where it's like it works the opposite, which is like, if you don't feel like you got it this week, don't worry, there's next week.
Yeah, you got Sunday's always coming.
Yeah,
right?
like, there are gonna be weeks where you aren't feeling it. Ironically enough, sometimes those weeks that I'm not feeling it are weeks that people come up to me afterwards and they're like, that really hit home for me. Because you don't, as much as you know your congregation, and particularly in like this size congregation, which is much more pastoral size congregation versus Broadway, which is much more of like a corporate or, you know, like program style church, this one is not. And it gives you the gift of, like, I know, like, I'm not preaching to, like, maybe this kind of group. I'm not trying to, like, all right, this has to appeal to high schoolers and to 80-year-olds and to 60-year-olds. I'm like, no, I'm preaching to, like, Maggie and Christy and, you know, Fred. I'm thinking about individual people in my congregation, not because I'm, like, preaching at them, but because, like, I know who they are. And it's like, sometimes I drop in the little references. My friend Ryan, who's a part of the congregation, it's like, he gets the reference where, like, this week there was a line about how I could do that in less time than it would take me to watch an Avengers movie. And you're like, he knows exactly what it is. I'm like, who knows? You know, it works for everybody else in the way that they know it's a long time, but he's laughing because Avengers Endgame is a 3-hour movie.
Yeah. Oh my God.
And it's those kind of things. Or it's like, and you never quite know, but that joke was not written for, like, everybody in general. It was written for one person.
Right.
Like, I'm going to throw this line in there, and everybody else doesn't need to.
There's a beauty. There's such a beauty
not
to that.
to know everything, and that was a real gift. And that to know, okay, this might not work this week, but there will be another week. And the honesty of teenagers. Like, they tell you when it doesn't work, and they, you know, sometimes adults are a little too kind about it. I still remember about a year. So I've been here through two Christmases now, been here, you know, a year and a half. And I remember about 6 or 7 months in, I went to the elders and I was, like, trying to provoke them to complain about me. They were like, it felt like all I got from folks was stuff that they liked. And I was like, I'm sure there are things I do that irritate you.
Right.
Like, and I want to, like, if it's a formational thing for me, there are certain things that, like, if that bugs you, I'm sorry, but, like, I'm doing it for a reason.
Yeah.
Like, I believe in why I'm doing it. And then there are ones that are like, I don't really know that I'm doing this. And if you tell me that I'm doing it, I'm happy to, like, shift this and make that better for you. And so I was, like, sort of seeking some constructive criticism, and I was, like, struggling to get it because these are adults who, and in general, that's the, like, they weren't lying to me. There wasn't like a bunch of criticisms in their head that they were thinking about. They were just thinking about it from this, like, no, I've been really happy. Like, I'm curious to see what else you do. Not this sort of part of, like, you're like, sometimes I love the teenagers who just be like, I didn't like that game, or that was a really boring Bible study. And you're like, all right, next week we got to make sure we add this kind of a thing to make it a little less
immediate feedback versus grumblings that maybe come back to you later, maybe don't
Maybe
even come
don't.
back.
Well, and I mean, I'm blessed. This is a congregation where we just had an elders meeting where we're talking about a new thing that we're going to be maybe doing at the board level. And I had an elder, and so I was informing the elders about what these discussions that were going on in another committee. And the elders, one of the elders, like, had a lot of response to it. You know, she had a pretty strong response to it. She went home, she thought about it, she considered it, and then she emailed me, and it turned into I was so grateful that she did, that she trusted me with this, like, her hesitancy about this, because whether or not that thing ends up happening, like, I now know how she feels. I know what's true for her and, like, her perspective. And I'm a person who believes that we get to the best decision by including as many opinions and expressions as you can, and then handing that to the people who are tasked with that particular job to make that decision. So in this case, it will be a board decision. So the board gets to make that decision. It's not my decision. It's their decision, but, like, I can bring her I have her permission to bring her wisdom into the room and share, like, here are some of the conversations I've been having about this that you need to know before you make this decision.
That's powerful.
And it's like, I'm really, I'm grateful for that wisdom versus, like, that is experience with criticism. That's like long form criticism in a way that teenagers don't give you that kind of feedback.
No,
they just tell you, I didn't like that game.
No.
Right. And
but it's so important to have feedback in the various levels. Like, I remember, I guess I was in a celebratory mood. UCC doesn't do communion every Sunday. And I guess I was in a celebratory mood during communion, and I'm talking, and I'm often babble at the table.
Me too. I think I taught you that one.
Exactly. Well, in this church congregation, I have to uncover all of the things, and it's a process. So I'm just talking the whole time to pass time. And I'm in a celebratory mood, and I guess I say, let's eat when it's time to partake. And apparently one or two people were perturbed by the way that they felt that I approached it with too much levity.
Yeah.
And that didn't trickle to me until like 4 or 5 months later. I had no idea.
Yeah.
And it was like, I might have addressed that and might have looked at that internally if I had known that before.
Well, I know, but that's the sort of part of, like, what you can do with it now is go, like, all right, I can be a little more intentional, and you can hopefully go to that person and say, like, that was an off the cuff thing, and here's what I was thinking. Like, I was excited, I was celebrating, I was seeing communion as being sort of the heavenly banquet, the party in the sky, or this sort of language of, like, the great feast beyond all feasts. And you're like, when you show up to feast, Jesus is going to say, let's eat. I mean, come on now. Like, and so there is something to it, but, like, that doesn't mean that it diminishes the sacredness of the moment. And that person may hear that. They may not hear that.
Yeah,
like,
of course.
But, like, it gives you a chance to, like, meet them where they are at. And hopefully it gives them, you can take the criticism, like, as a, like, I mean, at least I hope to never be flippant in ministry. Like, you don't want, I'm not ever intentionally dismissive of another person. Like, you have something to teach me, even if what I need to learn is, like, I'm not going to listen to your perspective because I don't agree.
Right.
But, like, it doesn't mean they're wrong. It just means it's not right for me. It just means, like, we have some, like, there needs to be a bridge built there because there is a divide. And usually I have found most people want to build that bridge. But the struggle is, like, you can use that to kind of go, like, all right, because especially us that like to be a little more extemporaneous can get ourselves into trouble where you do something that you wouldn't normally do. You're like, that's not a thing I would regularly say. It's sort of like, I don't cuss in the pulpit because I don't want it to get in the way of somebody listening.
Right.
I don't know that I theologically think that word has a separate meaning that is somehow more defamatory than something else we can say in the pulpit. It's the same reason I dress up on Sunday mornings. I don't need to dress up for God. I'm like, God walks around with me every day. He knows what I look like in my underwear.
But somebody might need that.
But like if you are staring at me and all you can think is like, he's wearing jeans and a t-shirt.
Oh my God.
Then I'm big enough that I don't care what I'm wearing.
We don't have that conversation. We don't have that discussion of like this idea that as a minister or just as a person in ministry, period, that it's our responsibility to mitigate some of the distractions.
Well, I mean, I think that's what Paul talks about when he's saying, don't be a stumbling block to your siblings in Christ. You know, don't intentionally make the family of God stumble. Me being defiant and I'm going to wear what I want to wear. That's not really about God. That's not really about my theology that really does express that God will welcome you in whatever form, whatever you're wearing, wherever you've been, wherever you're going. God is already there with you and welcomes you exactly the way you are. You are already a beloved child of God. But I don't know that me defiantly not wearing a shirt and tie on Sunday morning is really the best way to express that theology.
No.
And you don't usually argue people into change. But at the same time, you know, this is a thing we did at Broadway, like together. We used to do that good egg breakfast, and we'd kidnap kids out of their beds when they were going to be freshmen in, you know, coordinated kidnapping with parent permission and all the rest. And we'd come snatch them. They wouldn't know what Sunday we were coming, but we'd take them out to breakfast before church, and we'd feed them, and we'd celebrate them in front of the congregation. And we didn't let them get dressed. Yeah, they came wearing their pajamas. T-shirt. And so we as leaders wore our pajamas to church that week because it's like, I'm not going to ask you to be vulnerable in a way I'm not willing to be vulnerable. And there were, you know, I occasionally heard about it. There were some folks who didn't like that I was wearing a Superman onesie as I celebrated communion one Sunday. But for that person, there was also 3 or 4 that was like, that was so powerful that you just brought what was happening in the lives of this congregation with you to the communion table. It's the same thing that I was so grateful. My kids were really little at Broadway, and I still remember, I don't even know which kid it was. I remember doing communion with a kid on my hip, and the congregation celebrated that because it's just you being like, I don't have to stop being dad to be pastor. Pastor and dad are both part of my identity, and they're both worthy to be at the communion table together. And that matches my theology, but it also like is really affirming for me as a pastor. And it's those kind of moments that teach that you're already a beloved child of God way more than what I wear on Sunday morning. I mean, this is the whole thing. Classically in the church, that's what robes started as. Robes were a way for pastors to be a blank slate, so that nobody was focused on it. And unfortunately, in our day and age, a lot of female pastors still need to wear a robe because if they don't, they get comments about what they wear.
Which is outrageous. That's idea. I mean, there's nowhere that Jesus presents as walking around in holy garb.
No.
You know, I mean.
But that's the part of going like, there is a burden and a responsibility as pastor to do our best to not get in the way of people's spiritual growth.
So how do we usher in some of that change that we see is needed in congregations and community and not be my viewpoint has always been, I feel like clergy in general, we've always kind of tiptoed around traditions and feelings and personalities, probably to a detriment.
Yeah, that there's sometimes I'm going to let one person's emotional experience derail a vision process for the church.
It just leads to stagnancy and conformity.
I don't think I'm spilling the beans or throwing shade at all, but there was a part where like when the contemporary service got started at Broadway, it took them like 7 years to launch because every time they started to get launching, they like would pull back the reins a little bit because there might be some discomfort in the community or from an individual about what you're doing. And it is a fine line between taking the time to let people come to terms with what's going to happen so that they can participate and not walk away with, resentment or grudge that gets in the way of their ability to hear what God might be doing with them. But for me, the fine line really comes from, you have to make sure that you have conversations in spaces like committees and board places where oppositional feedback is not just tolerated, but
welcome,
encouraged, in the sense that so that whatever it is had on the level. But then as a pastor, I think you have to sort of believe in the process. You cannot just, there's sort of this part of you have to be the one to drive the ship on the sort of thing of going we can take the time we've set for this process, but we're not going to stop the process in the midst of it. We're going to try and build consensus, but we're not going to wait for 100% agreement, because you never agree 100% on anything.
Right.
And so you have to kind of build consensus, but then be willing to move forward. And that's the part of I find that, it's pastoral relationships that usually do that work, is trying to understand with genuine curiosity why that one person's struggling with how they're struggling. I remember when we talked about being open and affirming as a congregation at Broadway, a lot of the conversations were people who just needed the space to process, this is different than what I was handed as a child. And it wasn't because they wanted to exclude people.
Yeah.
It's that they didn't know how to process that, and they needed to be given the holy space to do that work without them feeling I'm going to sit there and tell them you're wrong.
Right.
We may disagree on this issue, but I'm not that doesn't mean I have it all figured out. I could be wrong too.
Your thoughts and your feelings are honored,
and I genuinely believe that the thing we will come to need, if we especially in that sense of if we're trying to include everybody, we need people who are feeling left out of the process because we're moving too quickly in the process too. And you need to make space for that. But sometimes as a pastor, you can kind of get the sense that this isn't really about what we're doing. Sometimes it's about a different issue, and you can't stop one thing because someone else has trauma or, resentment from another moment in their life that they are projecting onto this moment. You can honor them, you can love them, you can walk with them, you can suggest things, you can offer processes to helpfully address the grief or whatever the emotion is that is feeding that energy.
Right.
But you have to find and it's so hard. I think that's the greatest skill of ministry, is to know when to push and when to take a break. And for me, I feel I find that knowledge by building those relationships with everybody in the room. I want to know why you're saying what you're saying. And if I don't know, then I have genuine desire to know it. Not because I need to know what you're, I want to know why you're going to argue with me so I can counter your argument, but because you might have something to teach me there. That is not my perspective. It's not a thing. It's not the way I see the world.
Right.
But we all see the world differently, and you have something to bring based on the way you see the world. We are all changed because of what each person brings to the table. As a community of faith, as a family of God, we are shaped because of the strengths and the weaknesses of every person at that table. And it's you got to bring up that chair. We did a lot of work with particularly families with children with disabilities at Broadway that I loved, because I had always believed that we were better as a community because everybody was welcome at the table. But I watched, I had the joy of baptizing kids with disabilities, and I had the joy of watching kids with disabilities get baptized. And I still remember when Blake was baptized at Broadway, and he comes into the tub with Tim, and he's talking to him, and he's using Blake's age-appropriate language with him about how do you know how much God loves you? And Blake's yes. And then because we had prepped it. We walked through it. Blake knew we were supposed to go under the water, and Blake's like, time to go under the water now. And Tim tried to stop him, and he just dunked himself. And he came up smiling and laughing, and Tim was like chasing him around the tub. And the beauty of that was he brought such joy to that moment. It will forever change the way I see baptism because of his spirit. I am better because I was a part of a community that Blake was a part of.
Yeah.
It had nothing to do with his ability or disability. It had to do with his personhood. And that wisdom that comes from including someone with a disability or someone who's applies to anyone who's different than me,
right?
Like, which is everybody, because everybody's different than me,
right?
And so I know, and I have been shown over and over again, particularly by kids with disabilities, just how much better I and the whole community are because of their participation. And it is so worth whatever accommodations you might need to make to like welcome them in.
Accommodations.
Yeah. Well, and most of the time it's just, letting them be that. I mean, it's not really doing, you don't have to do a whole lot sometimes. There was a young girl named Maria who'd come to church, and she would clap after the organ finished playing. She was a nonverbal kid, so it was hard to ever really know what Maria was thinking. But she was praising God by clapping after the organ. Amen. And it took that traditional congregation, the traditional service, a little bit of time to kind of, they didn't really like clapping after songs. Like, they're like, this is a wonderful gift to God. It's not like a concert. And you're like, well, that's not why she's clapping. And it was very clear that's not, that's not why she's clapping either. She is celebrating. And it was like, she made that whole service. She eased the tension in the room, and it helped the rest of us put down some of our own desire to perform in a certain way, because she didn't have that barrier that I have. I'm self-conscious. I'm worried that how I'm going to be judged. What am I going to screw up? How is this going to look? And she wasn't.
Just free.
She was free in a way that, and I'm so grateful that our relationship, our genuine relationship, allowed me to learn that from her. That was like, that's such a gift from her to me. Like, regardless of what I was able to do for her, like, she gave to me in a way that was so transformative. And I think seeing other people differently and seeing what they might bring to any conversation helps find that line between pushing and waiting. Because sometimes you need to wait so that person can catch up. And sometimes you need to push ahead so that person can be pulled out of their stuckness. And the only way we know that is, I think that's the part of, like, I try and trust my pastoral intuition that I have spent years trying to form and trying to remove my own ego from. That's like, for me, the spiritual disciplines do that big part of, like, they try and separate the ministry instinct from what I want done to what I believe God wants done. And it's like, I don't really care what Nick wants.
So, maybe I'm naive enough to think that, like, change born in authenticity, where the Spirit is present, is the thing that we always push for, living out these ideals of Jesus. And it's being naive and being young enough to, like, for me, that, like, I have no fear of pushing for that change.
I think there's a big difference between being naive and being selfless in it. And the difference there is really, this is like, in philosophy, they'd call it like the second naivete, right? That there's sort of like self-growth, and evolution is a circle. It's like a process of action and reflection and more action, and it sort of cycles. Right. And if we're doing that work, God is working in that process to help us grow and change and learn. And Like, so you have to take that naivete and you have to trust that naivete, but then you have to not hold on to that naivete either, because that can become its own form of oblivience. And you can be, I have watched pastors do harm to individuals because they were trying to cultivate that naivete in themselves.
Yeah.
And you're like, it is about trust and belief that this thing that seems impossible can work. I mean, that's the beauty of the life, death, and resurrection story, right? That's the beauty of Scripture, of like, when we don't think it will happen, it can still happen. And I genuinely believe that, even when I feel like it is just darkness at this moment. It is just the end here. But I hold out hope, not because it always works out, but because that's the sort of like, there is something in the song of all creation, in the beauty of who we are and formed as human beings, that God did this with us. This is by design. There is this process is, that's the sort of part of like trying to put words to it. Is it part of the learning process? Sure. Is it always just for learning? Like, no, I don't think all evil or all darkness is for the purpose of learning, but it's sort of like we as individuals are given this opportunity to like grow because we wait for something that we can't see. We trust in something we don't know. And that is fundamental to faith. I mean, that's the sort of like, that's Paul saying all we can see now is through the mirror dimly. You kind of see this outline of there can be resurrection on the other end of this thing, whether that's personal conflict, whether that's congregational conflict, whether that's misunderstanding. It can work in all of those circumstances. But like, if we as individuals have to do this sort of part of like, we have to trust in that without just eliminating all the other parts of us that will help make that true. We are not toddlers trying to be naive in the world. We are grown adults trying to behave like children. And that's the sort of part of like, it isn't the idea that like, oh, it's just children who are right. No, it's the spirit of children. It's the trust of children. It's the childlikeness of children that Jesus was after when he talked about that. And so he's teaching us as adults to be childlike in our enthusiasm, in our openness, in our trust that this can be something more than it is right now, even if I don't know what the more is. Yeah,
the freedom of authenticity, and there's
and
a
so
lot
you have
to be said of that.
You have to find a way to be authentic, and then you have to find a way to be open enough, and that's where that naivete comes into play. It's like you need a little bit of that to remain open, because if you don't have it, then you come to these conclusions that you think you know what will happen. Like, I can extrapolate and plan for everything that will.
Right. Well, is that maybe replaced with like a true sense of humility then?
Yeah.
Removing your own attachment to outcome in that way.
And I mean, my preference would be to go towards like, to letting go of some of those things, letting go of your desire for an outcome. But the struggle with it is I don't see it as like Jesus encouraging us to be Buddhists who are really disattached from everything. I think it's like, no, you have to leave. It's open-ended. And that's where, for me, openness really works. And the authenticity is like that's the internal work. You have to do your work to say, is this what I really think? And if you're not doing that work, then you can't really be present to another person, because you bring all of you into the room with you, whether you're pastor or person. Like, that's not just a pastoral skill. You have to be able to like differentiate between them and me. What's on my side of the fence? What's on their side of the fence? What can I do about what's on my side of the fence? And then genuinely, how do I trust them with what's on their side of the fence? One of the things that I certainly had to learn later in life was the sort of idea that the desire for controlling the outcome often is associated with fear. I am afraid it will come out poorly, and I think I know best, and what I know, I believe is the better outcome, and so I want control so that I can make a good thing happen. But what you can miss, and what I've learned, is the sort of part of going like, that is fear. That's me being afraid and wanting control so that I don't feel scared. And so the gift of that is to say, I don't have control of what's on your side of the fence. I'm going to trust you with your part, and I'm going to do my best with my part. Like, I'm going to make sure that what I'm talking about is really about me, like what I really know, what I really understand, and isn't something I've been fed that I haven't really evaluated, or something else that, like it's not coming from the wider culture or this other thing. It's like me in this moment, what I genuinely think. And if you can find that integrity in that question, in that inner exchange, then that leads to that second naivete, that deeper piece of like, then you can be open enough to hear what they're saying. But when I'm scared, when I want control, I'm not listening to what they're saying because I've already made up my mind about what they're going to say before they say it. And you're like, well, I know what's best for you is like the ultimate ego trip. And I found myself doing that in ways that, with the best of intentions. And that's the sort of part of like, but it's about fear. And I don't think it's by accident that Scripture's most common phrase is, do not fear.
Right.
Like,
well, there's the surrender piece of faith, right?
Yeah.
That's a huge component of.
And it's that, which is the like, and do not fear is like, well, you just walk around into every danger moment. No, it's like literally about like, you are not in control. And I'm like, thank goodness, most of the time, right? Like, the world does not need another Jesus. Like, they certainly don't need me to try and be another Jesus. We've already got that. Like, my job is to not be Jesus in the moment.
The formation and the humility to be able to step back outside of yourself and say, I don't need to be the person
I don't
driving the ship all the time.
Well, and that's the part of like, you have to find the balance between like, how do I not just not do things then? Like, how do I just like, I'm going to just trust the Spirit enough and like, I'm not going to put my hands on the wheel. Like, nope, no, you're still driving the car. You're just trying to not plan every stop along the road. You have to find that the sacred dance is between us and God, and they're sort of like me saying to God, like, okay, God, what is it that I'm doing next? And God, and being able to listen for God's voice to say, not like, here's where you're going, but like, here's what you do next.
And
what's the next good thing?
I mean, faith is the investment in the process, not so much the investment in the outcome.
Right. And that's finding that gift is really being able to like let go of that enough to see that not being in control is a gift. I don't want to, there are like lots of times in faith where I end up in conversations and we're talking about somebody or something, and it's like, I don't really know. And I'm so glad that's not my decision. Like, Jesus is like, don't judge people. And I'm like, there are so many times where it's like my instinct is to judge people. And it's like, I am so glad I'm not in control of judging them, because either I'm going to be too harsh or I'm not going to, like, I'm going to be too lenient. And it's like, both of those things are probably true. And it's like, thank goodness that's not my call.
Right.
And like the extension of like, I know the best outcome is a sense of saying, I do want that choice. And it's like, no, I actually don't. It's having enough trust in myself and in God to say like, no, I don't actually want to control the outcome. I want to be faithful in the process. I want to, like, there are lots of things about Scripture. Like this relates back to that conversation with that freshman in high school. You really want me to like walk into a high school locker room tomorrow morning, and if I get, picked on or slapped or something, I'm supposed to literally turn the other cheek and walk away? And it's like, it doesn't make sense. It is weird and strange, but like, we have to find the way to make that true. And that's the part of like the wisdom is like Scripture teaches, and like scholarship and biblical understanding around that passage is like, it's way more transformative than I was having in a conversation with that freshman, now you look at it as like you turn the other cheek is a way of requiring them to hit you again. It's a form of, it is not passivity, it's nonviolence. And in the truest Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr. kind of nonviolence, like I am going to sit at this lunch counter and I'm going to expect service, even if I know you're not going to serve me. And then you're going to try and perhaps be violent with me in order to try and get me to leave. Like,
just so revolutionary. And
I'm going to use that to provoke more. And it's like, it's, you know, and what does that look like for a freshman in high school, in a high school locker room where they get slapped? I have no idea. Like, I do not presume to know exactly what that means for you, but like, I do know that Jesus did really mean it and wants us to try. And then despite the way that we look at that as like an impossible outcome, it's like our job is to try and lean into it. I mean, it's like, why do we love our enemies? Don't really know. Like, I don't want to love my enemies. But like Jesus is like, no, the best way to live the kingdom of God, which is like the wholeness of all creation brought together into this one moment, this one instance, does include that person you hate right now. Like, that does not make sense. That is weird and strange, and somehow I have to like let go that, like, I know that that's like my idea of what heaven is better than God's idea. There's like, that's idolic. Like, that's the sort of part of like, I am usurping that power and I'm trying to claim it for myself. Right. And you're like, so what I do know is that like giving up that desire, letting go of that fear helps me to be more present with the people. It allows, I believe, the Spirit to do its work easier because it's like one less voice that the Spirit has to talk over. It's like, if I quiet my ego, then like God's voice is able to shine through more.
So you take a little bit of time off in between. I wouldn't even call it time off, but you take a step away from congregational ministry.
I left Broadway not knowing what the next step was.
Yeah.
And so the average pastoral call process is 9 to 18 months. So it's like, if you're lucky, you've got your next gig lined up 9 months after you need it. And that's why often pastors don't leave congregations and kind of do the dual dance of like, I'm going to keep serving in one place.
But I'm looking.
Some of that was COVID. Some of that was my own life. Some of that was where the congregation and my ministry with them was. Some of that was where the point was. But it was clear, like, I needed to step away without knowing what was next. And so I did.
What did that time for you? I mean, obviously you transitioned into a different role and serving congregations and communities, kind of in a different way of
it did, but I didn't know that when I left.
Right. It was
I mean, there was parts of that process where I genuinely asked, should I go back into congregational ministry? Like, is this really where God's calling me next? And I didn't know the answer to that. And I'm really grateful for the space and time to try and figure that out. I'm also grateful for the way in which not having the next step allowed me a chance to ask the question in a more authentic way. And some of my own skills and background and experience had put me in a position where I got a couple of calls from some friends who were like, can you help me with this tech stuff? Like, I had done online video stuff before. I had done some podcasting things. I had done, like, we had set up cameras at Broadway and did some video projection work. And we had done a lot of that stuff. And I have a background in web development and all this sort of thing. And so I'm a bit of a camera nerd. Like, that's the sort of thing of going like, I like YouTube probably too much. And so I had these sort of all these skills. And so I said yes. They're like, can we hire you to come consult and help us figure out how to do this? Because, you know, this pastor who called me is like, you know, my undergraduate degree is in English. Like, you know, it's not in computer graphics. It's not in this stuff. I mean, that's where it's like, I took some video production. I have a minor in photography. Like, you know, like, I had some training that got me to that moment. And then I had experiences. And so I did that. And at one point I contemplated, like, I could probably do enough work to like consult with churches full time and just go from church to church helping. The need was there. There was a lot of experience with it. And having the pastoral experience meant I knew how congregations worked in their decision making process. Like, a videographer doesn't really know how a church functions necessarily.
Right, yeah.
Like, they don't realize that, like, sometimes you do have to like pull back on the reins, and that doesn't mean they're not committed to it. It might mean that they have to settle something or figure out what they really think, because there's more than one person making this decision. When you consult for a business, you have the boss, like, and they may want to get other input, but at the end of the day, the buck stops with one person. Yeah. Some congregations function that way, but a lot don't. In Disciples, we officially are ex officio members of the board. Like, at the end of the day, we get a lot of sway. We don't get a vote.
Right.
And so knowing that process was really helpful. But what I discovered is tying my income to the work I'm doing in that way felt not right for me. Like, going out and trying to like shake the trees to raise more sales, to make my services more available to folks, started feeling like it wasn't where God was calling me to be. And I was like, I enjoyed the like congregations that I got to work with in those like 9 months or whatever it ended up being, and the ways that like I helped them, and they were really grateful for that help, and they did not feel like exploited or like I, like did it. And I just basically set an hourly fee, and folks would pay me by the hour, and I could ask them, like, do you really want me to do this? This is what it's going to cost. Like, this part of the project takes 5 hours. Do you want me to go do that 5 hours of work? And they'd go like, yes. Or they'd say no. And that was fine. I had one congregation who, like, we did a whole proposal process, and then they ultimately went with a video like production firm because they wanted more like installation and more like they wanted someone with construction permits, and I don't have construction permits, like, and I don't want construction permits. Right. Like, and I wasn't going to flesh out the business to make that true, even if I could charge them the equivalent that I would need to make to do it. It was like, I don't have interest in doing that. Like, I bring the pastoral knowledge and the experience of how this can work to you. And I like, these are the solutions that are out there for you. Let's talk about which one suits you and why, whether you know that ahead of time or not. And that discernment process was part of, for me, what reminded me of the pastoral congregational work that I loved doing. And so Paul Koch, who's the regional minister here, called me and is like, you should interview in Boonville. And I was like, Boonville's not going to want me. Like, I had some dismissive thoughts that, like, I made this assumption that this was an older congregation that wouldn't be excited about who I was and what I wanted to do next. And the opposite was true.
Yeah.
Like, the opposite was true. I started talking to them, and their search process, they didn't know exactly what they wanted. And I was in a position where it sounds kind of arrogant to say, but because I was doing this consulting work, I didn't need them to hire me.
Right.
Like, I didn't walk into it trying to like convince them. I didn't have an outcome in mind for them because, I mean, honestly, when we started the conversation, I assumed it wouldn't be me. And so I talked to them, and they, like, that process, working with that wonderful search committee, ignited in me the like desire to like do here's where we can go. Here is step one of what will be a 10-step process, but here is step one, and waiting to see if they'll do it. I still remember I asked the search chair, we were sitting in the search committee meeting, and they were asking me this thing, and they were like, what do you see as the biggest challenge for the church going forward? And I said, knowing who you are and knowing how to share that with people in the community. And they were like, how do you know who you are? And I was like, that's a great question. Like, and it's different in every context. And they were like, how would you start? And I said, I would try and give everybody on the board the homework to go talk to a person in town that they know a little bit, and ask them, who has no connection to the congregation whatsoever, what do you know about this church? And like try and listen to like how are you already known? Who do people who do not come here, who do not associate with us, what do they think of? What is your genuine reputation in the community? Right. And so I said it in the course of the process. I believed it. It's a good idea. It's certainly where I want to start. And the next time we talked, we were like going through logistics or some other thing about the job. And we get kind of towards the end and we have a quiet moment. And he looks at me and he goes, so I talked to my neighbor. And it's like, okay. And he's like, I asked him, what do you know about First Christian Church? And I was like, ooh, I definitely want to hear what his answer was. And he was like, I didn't believe him. And I was like, what? He's like, he gave me a bunch of nice things about the church, but like, I don't think he told me the truth. I think he told me, like, he wanted me to feel good about my church. And so he told me what he thought I wanted to hear. And he was like, and he said to me, so how do we really get the answer to that? And I was like, that is a great question. And I don't know. And it was like in that moment that he took my suggestion seriously, and he did step 1 without knowing, like we hadn't even discussed step 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. Right. We didn't know where we were going yet, but we knew where we were starting, and he did it. He took that step, and it was like, if this church can be full of people who will take step 1 and trust the process, like it's not that he trusted me, he trusted God in that moment to try and, like, I'm going to go do a slightly awkward thing, which is like talk to my neighbor about what they know about my church. And he did it. And I was like, that told me more than like, all the other things. And then this congregation needed some things that I had experience doing. Like it needed some, we still do need some administrative work. That we're a church that still doesn't have a website. There's some of these things that like they've done enough to be, you can go watch us on YouTube every Sunday, but like there's a pretty active group on our Facebook page, but like, that's not necessarily the way that a stranger is going to come and find out who we are. And so it's like, we got some work to do with sharing who we are with the community in a genuine way, but like that they want to know who they are. They want to answer those questions. They want to know who God can make them into in the next 5 years or 10 years. And it was like, that answered the question for me. And it was like, it sort of blew the idea of consulting out of the water. And I was like, wait, I can like go do this in one place with one group of people for, it was sort of like the change between knocking on the doors of hospital rooms going like, I know I can have a good interaction in this room, but like, I can see where this goes. And I was like, yep, I'm in.
Well, first I have to acknowledge that your transitions that you've made through ministry were hugely impactful for me because, I had gotten to a point where I was ready to just put it aside. I was ready to just accept that God had called me to do something else with my life and step away.
As your friend and, one-time pastor, I was, how does that work now? Like, I don't like imagine myself as being your pastor, but I do hope to have that positive mentor influence on you. That was one of those moments where I felt like that parent going like, I don't know what to do. I don't know how to encourage him at this moment. Like all the things in your own journey that sort of like some of your own consequences for your own actions met with the injustice of systems that make things happen and all those sort of parts and going like, I know God can do great things with this person. Like, I believe it. I trust it. But like, I don't know what that outcome is. And I had that moment of going like, and I know that you could have made a perfectly good person and a wonderful person in a thing. And you could have served God through whatever career you ended up in. But there was part of me that was like, yeah, I hope he ends up back in it. But how that was going to happen, I had no idea. And like,
I mean, I had the same thought process, right? Like, from the very beginning, like the first time I ever, Terry pulled me in to preach a thing when I was very young, and had no intention of going in that direction, and spending time with you and Jacob and Tim and getting to see the behind the scenes.
Yeah.
Okay, this is of interest to me.
Yeah.
But yeah, going through life stuff and being ready to really put it aside and say, God, if this is what you want me to do, then things have to shift, and there has to be a place.
So for you were starting into a question as I shared about my own anxiety for you, but what was it about my transitions that impacted you?
Well, there's multifaceted. So the first piece is, your first experiences at that church. And I'm familiar with, the stories of how you got pulled into ministry.
Yeah.
And
most of what we've shared today isn't brand new to you.
Right. But it's transformative in this idea of just being servant-hearted and willing to serve. And, I found myself at my church through just being friendly with a coworker, and her knowing some of my background, and them needing a pulpit filled for one Sunday, and with the intention of, hey, I haven't preached in a while. It'll be fun to go fill a pulpit.
Let's go exercise that muscle.
Exactly. Let's go stretch these legs and see if I still have that tool on my tool belt, and if I don't, awesome. And so experimented with that and did 2 Sundays, and then to have a congregation that says, hey, we have members, you've preached here twice, and we have members that we're in search for a pastor, and we have members that would like for you to be entered into that search process. And for me to say, absolutely not. I'm not called to be here. I've got a job. I'm good. But I'm happy to serve and fill your pulpit whenever you need.
Yeah.
And then that being led into, can you be here for the season of Lent all the way through Easter?
Yeah.
And that being led into, well, we need you for just a little bit longer. Me saying, okay, well, until you find that person.
That I don't know if you even remember that version of my story, but telling David at that Friday night of going like, I heard myself say yes before I had really internally say yes, and then wanting to qualify it because like, I think that's a genuine part of the Spirit. It isn't that it wasn't my fear that qualified it. I hope it was some of my humility, and to have the humility to say, like, I don't want to do this just because you want me to do this. Like, there's something bigger here, and to take your time with the congregation to go through that process. And I don't know if that was in your thought process at all.
Absolutely.
But like, to give yourself some space and the congregation some space to honestly ask, like, is this right? Is, I think, really good. And that's the part of going, it was the same true for here. And I think in a lot of really good calls is when you can have the honesty. Unfortunately, I don't know how to change the system in such a way that happens more frequently. But I think the best conversations happen between churches and pastors when they both enter into it with interest, but without expectation or without real need.
Right.
But like, if you're in the midst of, I have a friend in the midst of the search and call process right now, and she is like, she needs the money too.
Yeah.
Like, there's a practical, like, she is looking for the next call on her life, but she also needs to pay rent and eat and do those things. And you can't wait forever.
Exactly.
And so finding ways to have that freedom to enter into genuine conversation without having a need for outcome can be really powerful. And I think if both the church and the person interviewing can do that, it can lead to big things. And I've always tried to do that for me, because that sort of sense of like, I've learned through experience. I mean, this is because I learned that, back in, more than 20 years ago now, like, I had some pastor people in my life who trusted me before I trusted me. I have this instinct to want to trust somebody before I trust myself in that way of like, God might be saying something here. And then also I've had people in my own life who have helped me do my work to not just go like, unfortunately, I think too many people get into ministry because churches are so enthusiastic to support a person in this moment of like, you show any sense of ministry and they're like, you're the pastor now. And people go like, they didn't really evaluate whether or not whether or not they were called to ministry, because I genuinely believe everybody is called to ministry, but like
what the capacity is.
Well, what the profession is. Like that's what is this your vocation as well? And that was the thing. Like for you, I didn't know.
Yeah.
I thought it was like my ego was saying, no, I think it is, but my opinion is not the end all be all.
Right.
And that sort of part of going like, I don't know, I have to trust God with that process with you as well as I have to trust God with that process with myself. And I hope that is an example of faithfulness and not naivete or overexcitement. And that's the sort of part of like having people around you who can help you answer the question, like, is this what you really want? I was interviewing, when I interviewed for Broadway, I interviewed for a congregation in Southern California that was basically going to be a new church plant coming out of an existing congregation. And it's what I thought I wanted. I mean, it was like, that was much more of like, I got done with Mission Bay in San Francisco and I thought, this is the continuation of this ministry in San Francisco, but in the LA area. And, now I can look back and go like, it so wasn't. I wouldn't have been ready for that.
Right.
Then in a way that I could maybe be more ready for that now. But because what I was thinking about was the outcomes. I was focused on what it is and the choice of going with Broadway over that congregation. And there were other factors in it. I don't even know if they would have chosen me in the end, but like I was in conversation with both churches at the same time at first. And so in my mind, I was kind of comparing, like I was imagining the different outcomes, but what it was at Broadway that really confirmed it for me was other people saying to me, when you talk about these two opportunities, your energy increases when you talk about Broadway, and it doesn't increase when you talk about this new church plant or replant or whatever you want to call it.
Right.
And so even though logic and like my assumption and my brain was like saying, this is the next step,
your heart and your spirit were
right? The spirit was clearly over here, and I had people I trusted around me to kind of like help me discern between those two, and that's a really valuable process.
Terry talks about when your brain falls into your heart.
Yes,
and there's something to be said of that. And I mean, as far as calls go, there's a lot of different ways that you can be pulled in these directions, right?
Well, that's the part, like the terrible thing of the like whole process of trying to call a pastor is the idea that like you are both doing that deep head into heart work and you're doing the logistics of job negotiation, which like when you negotiate a job, when you're looking at a prospective employer, it is a negotiation process of like, these are my needs and these are your needs. And like, how do you balance that with like just trying to figure out if it's head into heart work?
Makes you envy the Catholic Church some.
Yeah. Well, right. And sometimes the congregation doesn't know what their heart work is right now. And so you have to try and, I think sometimes when calls don't work out, it's because between the two, they didn't actually get to what the heart work needing to be done was. And I'm really grateful here in Boonville, the pastor who served here before me, Roger, has like a totally different skill set than I have. He is still an active part of the congregation. He was retired. He was a retired member of this congregation before they asked him to serve as pastor. He served here about 8 years, and he just loved them. like his spirit and his genuineness, and he loved them to a place where he did such soul work with this congregation where it uprooted some of the kind of disbelief they had in themselves and some of the like anxiety they had about who they should be or could be in the future. And so they were really ready to try and imagine who we are next.
Yeah.
And so they knew they wanted to find out who they were next, but they didn't know what the person would look like who'd help them do that, which is where the grace is through Paul Koch, who said to me, go interview with them. And I was like, oh, I mean, he called me and he's like, can I give them your profile? See if they're interested. And I was like, oh, okay. Shouldn't say no. I don't know what I want to do next, but that's not a big problem. Where I was in my own life at the moment, like it allowed me to prioritize some other things, which is like, I knew with my kids, I wanted to stay in the house I was in and give them some stability that they needed right then. And it all worked out where like God was like, all right, I'll show you the thing you're supposed to be doing next.
God's been working. God's been working in your life. Both stops. I mean, putting your paperwork in someone's hands,
well,
right?
And the hard part is going like, I don't know that that's the only way that works, but there's often this sort of like, that's the sort of the naivety or the simplicity of it is like, you just have to be watching for that next thing that comes along. It would have been really easy for me to say no.
Right.
And I said yes. And I went into the process open enough to like, that's where I've told this congregation this, so I don't think anybody'd be surprised to hear me say it, but they also they weren't like, it was a pretty crappy profile.
Right.
It looked like it would, on paper, this church did not look like the church I met.
Yeah.
Because they didn't know how to do that.
Which is how many churches that
they didn't
have
know
profiles.
how to put themselves on paper in a way that I, as a pastor, might have the same interest that I did to see what their potential was. And I'm so grateful that their search committee openly engaged with the process. They trusted that shuffle of the, like, we did our best, even if it wasn't very good at articulating who they were. And that's kind of the help they needed. And that's kind of when because we were having these conversations and I was having the conversation almost like in consultant mode on some level of going like, here's my instincts, here's my pastoral advice, here's what I think you would need to do next. And I didn't have this expectation that like X is going to lead to Y, which is going to lead to Z, which is going to lead to me being their pastor. Like, actually, I was sort of like, here's A and B, and it's going to lead you to a pastor C over there. And that was fine.
I mean, they were a genuine place.
This congregation was looking at and trying to evaluate. They're on the cusp between like family-sized and pastoral-sized congregation. They're right on that line between part-time and full-time ministry, hiring a pastor for that. And so they were looking at both. And I didn't want part-time ministry. Like I was like, no, I'm not. It's not what I want to do. But that's where Paul had this idea that maybe even if they were going to do part-time, they would do part-time, and then I could work for Paul part-time, doing some online, like doing some of the consultant work that I was already doing for this region and for churches in this region. And that would have been fine with me. Like that's sort of part of like, so like either way, because that's what I said to Paul, is like, I do want full-time. And he's like, even if it doesn't work out to be full-time with them, I could see it being full-time with both. And I was like, okay. And so that was, it met my initial checklist in a way that like, but their openness about it was so interesting to me. And then the pace of ministry was very different in a way that it's what I needed right now.
Yeah.
I always imagined one of the reasons the only reason I didn't want to do church planting is I was anxious about the idea of being solo. When you're a church planter, you don't have money for staff.
Right.
And so it's you, and you are the tech guy, you are the sound guy, you are the bulletin producer, you are the, you are the preacher, you are the pastor, you are the janitor. Like done it all. And at Mission Bay, I did it all. Like when we rented out the space for a wedding, I still remember the day I went into the Sunday school children's room and I smelled something really terrible, and I opened the drawer and some unfortunate wedding guest had puked in the drawer. And there was no, like, I was like, well, I guess I'm cleaning this up, because there was no one else to even ask if I was like it was, my only other option was to close the drawer and walk away and then have to do it later.
Right.
Like, no, all right. So, like, I've done all of that, and I was like, I wanted collaborative ministry. I wanted team stuff. I wanted something different. And I thought, like, and that's at Broadway, I had that, you know, like, even as an associate minister at one point, I mean, there were like 17 people on like, as I was the part-time lead minister, like, I was the temporary lead minister in the search and call process. Like, I had 17 different employees who were reporting to me. And even as I was the associate minister, I think I had 8.
Yeah.
Like, and I, some full-time, some part-time, you know, like, it's a lot. It's a lot of management. It's a lot of logistics. It requires you to plan much more in advance. And I walked into a circumstance where I don't have to do that.
Yeah.
Like, this season of ministry last summer, essentially, we did a whole sermon series on the book of Numbers. And I started it without having an endpoint to the sermon series. Like, because I was studying Numbers for myself in my own Bible study, right? In my own private study, I was reading Numbers, and I was kind of like, I was jiving with it. I was really like feeling it. And I was going like, this is like, I'm excited about this. And so you got to pick sermons. So I was like, in an elders meeting, I said to one of the elders, like, what do you think if I do a sermon or two on the book of Numbers? And this gentleman in his 70s looks at me and he goes, I've been a churchgoer my entire life. I can't tell you a single sermon I've ever heard on the book of Numbers. Absolutely, you should do that. So I was like, at that point, I was like, I can do 3. Like, I have beginning, middle, and end. And I did the first sermon, and I was like, that didn't really do enough with the beginning. Like, and folks were like, that was really interesting. And like, the feedback was like immediate and helpful. And so I did like sermon 1 part A, sermon 1 part B. And I think we did like 16 weeks on the book of Numbers.
Oh my gosh.
And, you know, it ventured all over the place in scripture, because like, the journey in the book of Numbers is sort of representative of this spiritual journey we've been talking about in our own lives. And so some of it was like, I'm going to tell you about why they're building the tabernacle the way they're building, but like, we're not going to spend all Sunday doing the biblical reasons why this tribe is given this role or this thing, which there are scholars who know that. I'm going to say like, no, like, the whole thing is about how God directed them to put God at the center of their traveling city. So what does it mean to have God at the center of our city as we are journeying on figuring out who we are?
Right.
And you're like, it's a much broader theme. And so you start getting it. And we were doing like the journey through the Bod Midbar, which is the Hebrew for the wilderness, which the book of Numbers is sort of unfortunately named, because it is about numbers. There's lots of quote numbers in the book of Numbers, but in the Hebrew, the scroll of Numbers was actually called the Midbar, the Ba Midbar, in the wilderness. That's the title of that scroll, because, you know, they leave, Exodus is leaving Egypt, and then Numbers is their journey in the wilderness. And the book of Numbers goes from leaving the wilderness entering into the wilderness, crossing, you know, out of the Red Sea into the wilderness. And then 40 years later, the book of Numbers ends with them staring into the promised land, just ready to enter in. And
more than 16 weeks there.
Right. Well, but like, and so you just over and over and over again in the book of Numbers, it's that same cycle of like entering into the wilderness and learning something about who we are, and then being prepared for what God has next. And so that's what we did for 16 weeks. And it was fantastic, but I could have never done that sermon series at Broadway because I didn't know where it ended before I started.
Corporate church of
because there are 3 worship services with 3 different musician planners who are all trying to pick music and have things arranged and do things, and like ministry, children's ministry and youth ministry is trying to piggyback on what we're doing in worship, and like it's just too much of an engine. Nothing wrong with it. I loved it while I was at Broadway, but it was like I needed the freedom that smaller congregational ministry offered me, and it's matched where my heart was coming out of that 9-month period.
Yeah.
And going like, I love it. In the conversation with them, they were like, will you teach a Sunday school class? And it was like, one? You just want me to teach one? And they're like, yeah. I'm like, what do you want it on? Whatever you want. Wait a minute. Like I was like, well, just, okay. Like, cause at Broadway, this is big church. You're advertising to, you know, at least pre-pandemic numbers and all that sort of stuff. Like they've been on their own journey since I've left them, but it was, you know, $350 on a Sunday morning, 3 different services. You have to like give them a pitch, right? You have to tell people, what is this Bible study about? How is this Bible study different than that Bible study and different than that Bible study? Because like not all 600 people, not all 350 who are there on a Sunday morning are showing up to your one Sunday school class.
Yeah.
Like, no, we have the one adult Sunday school class here.
Okay, so this is short answer.
Yeah.
Concept.
You did say long form podcast.
No. This particular section
Yeah.
is just short ideas. Where's the church going in the next 5 to 10, 20 years? What's it look like?
Lots of different things. I think the markers of identity will both the ones of the past will disappear and new ones will form, and those identities around communities of faith will look. The expression will be different based on each individual person. The local congregational thing is going to drive it, I think, as much as, you know, you look at things like politics these days and it's driven by a national conversation. I think church work is going to be the opposite. I think it really is driven by the local. And the more churches can be local, the more they're going to exist. If folks want large church, like if they want this sort of national church feel, no individual church is going to compete with the church that's putting in $40,000 a Sunday into their video production to do online stuff. Like, but there are lots and lots of people out there who don't want that. They want something authentic and unique, and they want it to be like hyper local expression of the church. And the beauty of the internet is that could be somebody, you know, it used to be that when you lost a member because they moved away, they can't participate anymore.
It was done, yeah.
Like now, we have members in New Mexico who were in-person members here with us a long time, mostly before me, but now live in New Mexico, where in the streaming of COVID allowed them to start attending church with their friends again. And so I think it's hyper local because it isn't just numbers on the internet. It's like, you know, it's Dave who's in New Mexico, and he's attending because of his personal relationship with the congregation, with other people that he sees, that the names shared at prayer time mean something to him in general. But then there are also folks who can attend at distance who need that or have that. And so church is going to be hybrid, and it's going to, I think the best churches are going to be some sort of unique expression of broad distinctions.
More smaller churches or less?
I think more smaller churches.
Okay.
I think the financials of large churches is going to be harder and harder because I think attractional ministry is harder and harder to do, where the idea that we're going to put out a program like Vacation Bible School, and that's going to bring in families with little kids. I'm not sure how well that really even worked a long time ago,
right?
But there were more people who were looking for church congregations. And so all they needed was an excuse to try a church. And so VBS became an excuse to try a church. And so then they were more resident. I think the only people who go to church these days are people who want to be there.
Right.
And you can see that really negatively, but I see that really positively, is that you have an opportunity as a church to build church out of people who really, really want to be there.
Genuine investment.
And so you don't need, and, this is the whole thing with like YouTube or whatever, like you don't need 1 million views. You need 1,000 people who care about what you're watching and what you're producing. You need the core, and churches need that core. And if you can develop a core in some way, that can be enough to, and then you can minister to a broader community than that. But like, that's how you exist. That's the part. The investment of people is how, so that's why they're smaller,
right?
Because in order to be bigger, you need a bigger number of investors. Like you need a bigger number of people who are willing to participate sacrificially in church.
Yeah, which is a huge piece.
Which is, sometimes it's financial, but it's not always financial. Sometimes it's, I've got a gentleman who, he comes by the building pretty much every day, every week, and he changes light bulbs and fixes things. And I could pay him. Like, he works for us, but it's his ministry. It's his care. He loves this place, and he is happy to do that work, and he does it selflessly. And his investment saves us a ton of money. Yeah. And so, like, that is his stewardship outside. I'm sure, like, outside of his financial giving, that's huge. And so you could there's a lot of communities that can exist with that kind of investment that doesn't come from financial. And that's where it's like, you need that sacrificial investment, that genuine giving of self to make this thing exist in the world.
So with these localized congregations, how is the real church work of Jesus and being radical about, speaking up for the marginalized and breaking down some of the divisive kind of ideas? How does that flourish through more localized, specialized congregations?
I think that flourishes because when you attend a church of 5,000, you often don't know other people who go there. And some of them mitigate that in all kinds of ways. But when you're part of a real local church, you know those folks. And it allows you to stop having the conversations in social media and in national, on television, and you have conversations with your neighbors about the differences that you have. And it allows you to, if you genuinely follow the words of Jesus as like, love those who are different than you, then you're going to find a way to I'm not talking about like, how do I love black people and solve systemic racism? It's like, how do I love Joe who lives down the street from me or comes to church with me? And if you do the radical work of like opening your eyes and loving the people who are local to you, that's one of our challenges here in Boonville is like, what are the real needs of this community? Who are the people here, and what do they really need? And not how do we recruit them to be part of what we're doing? Like, how do we serve them sacrificially as a congregation? And my experience is like, if you can identify that need really well, then you can do the work. And even if you can't sustain it as a local individual church, partners will come along and find ways to do that. Like, one of the things that was great about working at Broadway was the All God's Children program, which works with children with disabilities. And we didn't have the volunteers to staff this program, but we had a connection to the University of Missouri, and there were students in special ed who needed community service hours for their program that we could be. And so here were volunteers that we didn't even know, we didn't know where they were going to come from when we started it, but we knew what the need was. We had families in our church who had children with disabilities and who had lots of friends with families with disabilities that were there. And so it took us going we want to serve them, and we don't know exactly how that's going to look yet, but we're going to take step 1 and step 2. And so as a local congregation, if you know who are the marginalized in your local community. And my experience is if you have to do that with one-on-one people, it's sort of like when you have to solve and bridge the difference between you and me, then when you get attacked, I'm your biggest defender. Right. And you get that sort of transformation of it that way. And that's the sort of I think that's what the radicalness of Christ. And if we as the church can let go of like, what does that mean for who we are as church, and just do the work, if we can just find someone in need and then love them in a selfless, genuine fullness of God kind of way, then that's going to change us. That's going to make it us better. That's going to, make the church more welcoming to more people, because there's somebody else like you here already. Right. And if not, then we care about you enough to love you. So then we have to get to know you. I mean, that's the sort of part of like, whether that's welcoming a refugee, sponsoring a family, whether that's like whatever that need is, whether that's working on systemic racism, whether that's working with LGBT folks, whether that's working with like incarcerated people, like you name all of the major, whether it's working in housing, whatever you find is like a real need in our society today, the church can do things to address those needs. And both like in global ways, there's a Washington Avenue Christian Church. I think they're in Ohio. They got a little bit of extra mission money that they were going to do to go like attend this rally in DC to sort of like advocate with the Poor People's Campaign work. And the rally got canceled because of COVID. So they had some extra money. So they donated it to this organization that purchases medical debt and forgives it. It's called RIP Medical Debt. And so they started with the like $3,000 or whatever that they had in their budget to go on this trip. They didn't go on the trip, so they had $3,000 to spend. So they asked, like, how do we meet needs for poor people in the community? So they did it, and they've raised a bunch of stuff. They canceled $2.3 million worth of medical debt for people in their community because of their money, not because it was like, I don't know if it increased their numbers, but they took something they had and they asked what was a real need. They identified medical debt, and they were like, if we can free people from medical debt, they can live a better life. And they did it. Like, that is also so local, but like they addressed they didn't like walk down the street and try and figure out how to pay for Joe's medical debt. They found an organization that the brilliance of that organization is they will do it by zip code. Right. So like you can forgive the medical debt in this zip code. And so churches live in zip codes. Yeah. So you pick your zip code. So here in Boonville, we could do 65233. Like, you could do. That's and powerful. So it's like, and that is that's the future of the church as I see it. That's the genuine work of the Spirit, because that transforms people's lives and it transforms the other thing. I think one of the things that we lost in the 1950s of American church was the idea that we think church is for everybody as a way of like sitting in the pew on Sunday morning. I'm not sure that's true. Yeah. What I think I know is that God's love is for everybody, and God is going to use the church. I mean, this is back to the history of Israel. God's call on the people of Israel was to be a nation, a blessing to all nations. It was a nation blessing all nations. God didn't say, I pick you as my chosen people to just be the chosen people. No. You have a job to do. That's like the whole, Old Testament thing is a nation of priests. That's the foundation of priesthood of all believers. Yeah. And so if we as the local church look at it as saying, how do we love collectively those that Jesus would love in our midst?
Be the change you want to see in the world.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So this part is almost fill in the blank. Just finish the statement. Yeah. So change starts
within.
Grace speaks.
My gut was softly.
Okay. Yeah.
Which I there's a lot to unpack there, but I'm sticking with softly.
I like that. Love is
bold.
And God.
That's a huge thing.
That's a big one.
You got to give me a verb. What's my verb?
No,
God.
You pick the verb. That's the.
I mean, that the front brain thing was God is love, which is the super Sunday school answer, but also true.
Yeah. Is there a Sunday school answer anymore?
I almost sort of look at it as maybe it's God is with you. the God is love in my brain is always more of the like, you are a beloved child of God.
Yeah.
And that is the like stronger way to say God is love. You are a beloved child of God is the way of saying God is love. But like God is with you or God is here. God is present.
Yeah.
Is
Love that.
You can go very UCC. God is still speaking. That's
Yeah.
true too. But I'm stuck on God is. So
Yeah,
I don't know.
Yeah. I mean, immediately popped in my brain, God is everywhere.
I had a line in a sermon a couple weeks ago that I stole from the movie title, right? God is everywhere all at once.
That's great.
It was like absolutely everything everywhere all at once.
That's great.
Yeah.
When I heard that title, I thought it was a religious film, and it's
It's not, but
so
it's a
much.
great film.
Yeah.
And it's really a journey of self-exploration in a way that's really transformative. So
Art is powerful.
yeah.
Well, thank you so much for the time. I appreciate
You're
it.
most welcome.
Nick Larson, the pastor extraordinaire, theologian, mentor, father, friend, everything that you want in a person that's going to shepherd you and lead you.
Oh, wow.
And
I'm grateful for you, my friend, indeed.
yeah, he's here in Boonville, Missouri at First Christian Church. If you're ever in the area and you feel like stopping in, they have a YouTube that you can plug in. They're doing some cool ministry here.
Worship's at 10 a.m.
Yeah.
We'll be here every Sunday.
Every Sunday. Sunday's always coming.
Yeah.
Right. But thank you guys so much for tuning in. Hope you got something from this little talk, and the change you want to see in the world, it starts
We
with
gotta
you.
keep on evolving. Gotta be side by side. Give it up.